Welcome back. This final session is going to be looking at the process of interviewing. Now, this is usually going to occur after you've applied, but before an acceptance or a rejection decision is made. And we'll also talk a little bit about the process of acceptances versus rejections from various programs, and a little bit towards the end of the last video about what to do if you are in that unfortunate situation where you did not get into the schools that you were hoping for. But first, we're going to talk about the interview, what to do about it, what kind of questions are going to be asked, and kind of how you can, again, better increase your chance of getting the offer that you're hoping to get from the programs you're interested in. So recognize that most programs are going to have some form of interview, and these can range from as simple as a phone interview all the way up to an entire day or 2-day open house, where you'll be interviewed multiple times, you'll get to meet faculty, you'll get to learn more about the program. And again, these vary from various program to program. Now, most people are not very big fans of being interviewed, but I do want you to, again, recognize that if a program does not do interviews at all, that, again, is not a 100% sign that it's not particularly a good program, but it does mean that they are not that interested in learning more about their students, that they're going to be potentially let into their program. Most quality programs will include an interview in some form, and it doesn't hurt to get used to being interviewed. I would even suggest if you have interview anxiety, if you typically don't perform well with interviews, you may want to set up with either your faculty mentors or potentially either other students applying to grad school to practice interviewing, to do kind of dry runs, to get a better feel and to get more comfortable with the process. So this graph basically represents the idea that anxiety and performance are related, and that what we're looking for is that anxiety is not a bad thing. Anxiety makes us aware, it makes us alert. We just want to make sure we don't have too much anxiety. And generally what studies have found is actually that almost no anxiety, in other words, you're not very alert, you're not very in tune, your performance tends to be fairly bad. And performance increases actually as you become more alert, a little more worried about your performance, a little bit more thinking about what you're doing. But there is a certain point where that becomes what we call an upside down U relationship, where as you get more and more anxious, the anxiety starts to get in the way. So just kind of recognize your own base level of anxiety. Don't think of it as something that has to be completely eliminated, but you do want to get it to the point where that anxiety is helping you perform better, not necessarily hampering your performance. So the first thing to recognize, and probably one of the biggest pieces of advice is be a good listener and make sure you're not interrupting the person interviewing you. Social psychology has actually examined the relationship between interviews and also just communication in general between dyads or two people. And what's generally found is that one of the findings is that across the board, the more you talk, the more you think it went well, which means that if the person that's interviewing you is doing a fair amount of the talking, they're actually likely to think that that interview went very well. So a lot of times, people being interviewed think they have to interrupt and inject and talk a lot. You want to answer the questions, you want to answer them honestly, and you want to answer them in a positive way. But if you're being interviewed by someone who does tend to talk a lot, let them. It actually is more likely to result in you getting a higher rating from that person. So the first big piece of advice we have is really listen to what your interviewer is talking to you about. Really listen to their questions, and it's not a bad idea if you're not 100% sure what they asked, to ask them to repeat the question so that you can make sure that you're giving the right answer. And again, make sure you don't interrupt them trying to kind of take over the conversation. If they're wanting to spend most of the time talking, again, you should let them. So be aware of your nonverbals. Make sure that you're making moderate eye contact. Now, we do have a tendency when we're talking to others, especially when we're kind of thinking about a response, to look off a little bit. That's fine. And we don't want to basically give crazy stares at the person that's interviewing us either. But make sure you're not spending the entire interview staring at the floor, staring at the ceiling. Make sure you're making moderate eye contact. And this is, again, something that you can practice in dry runs. As far as attire, generally speaking, outside of a tuxedo and tails, you probably can't overdress. And in fact, generally speaking, it's not a bad idea to dress very professionally for any interview. You also want to watch your facial expressions. You want to make sure that you are showing intent. You want to be leaning towards the interviewer. You want to be making that moderate eye contact. And you basically want to be nodding along as they're talking to you. In other words, be a good listener. You want to watch that posture. Don't slump in the chair. Don't spread your legs out wide. You want to sit professionally and engage in the conversation. And also, look at the tone of your voice. You want to adjust that tone of voice and the pace to where you're answering at a moderate rate of volume and a moderate rate of speed. So if you tend to want to talk really, really fast or really, really loud when you're under stress, that's something, again, to work on in dry runs. You also probably want to look to make sure that you're not using a lot of filler terms. Now, filler terms are like ums, uhs, various noises that we put in when we're trying to think of what we want to say next. It's better to simply slow down, let your brain catch up with what you're thinking, and then kind of move forward without actually using those fillers. And again, depending on which is the problems you have, these are, again, things to work on in dry runs before you ever interview. Now, if you're someone that does a lot of ums and ahs, or for instances, some kind of verbal tag that you use to kind of give yourself a chance to catch up in your own thoughts, you may not be able to completely remove them by the time you do an interview, but be honest with yourself and even have others tell you. Listen, have them listen to you interview. And if they notice these, try to at least work on reducing them. All of these things are going to end up making a better impression on your interviewer, no matter what your actual responses are. In other words, nonverbals matter. The content of your answer is important too, but a really good answer with no eye contact, when you're poorly dressed, when you basically are expressing nothing with your face, when you're slumped in the chair and spoken very quickly, very loudly with lots of ums, is probably going to have less impact than a mediocre answer that included good nonverbals. So again, let's talk about everything as far as interviews can go from a phone interview to an on-site interview, but most of this advice is still the same. You want to make sure that you have knowledge of the program. In other words, you want to make sure you've done your homework before you do any interview with any organization that's looking to potentially bring you in as a graduate student. Make sure you know the faculty's names, broadly what they research, kind of the focus of the program, and some of the accomplishments of the program. Read their website, take some notes, and if it's a phone interview, you can even have those notes in front of you. You should show serious interest in the program, and that includes both verbally and, again, non-verbally. You want to convince them that you are truly interested in coming to this program. You want to make sure that you have a general knowledge of the area. So honestly, and by area, I mean actually kind of two things. You want to show that you're aware of where the university's at. What kind of, is it a rural area? Is it an actual city? But also the area that you're applying to as far as psychology. I would honestly suggest reviewing one of your old textbooks that are specifically in the area, whether it's clinical psychology, whether it's social psychology, whether it's cognitive psychology. Make sure that you're going into that interview, and if they ask some content area questions, you're ready to at least show that you have some general understanding. You want to stay positive throughout the interview process, and it's not a bad idea to prepare some answers. One of the resources we're giving you in this particular session is the last set of slides is actually not an audio lecture. It is specifically just a list of questions that you may be asked and questions you might want to ask. And again, I want to reiterate the importance of being professional at all times. And by that I mean you are being evaluated from the first point of contact, the first email asking for an interview, the first time you pick up the phone, or if it's an on-site visit, how you actually deal with the administrative staff, getting your parking permits, coming in on time, making sure you're well dressed, your interactions with undergraduates, graduates, staff, faculty. Be professional at all times, because there's a good chance that everyone you interact with will have at least some say in the admissions process. So let's talk about the graduate school interview. Phone interviews may be a screening interview. So when there's phone interviews, you may have a short screening interview to determine if they want to do a longer interview or a potential on-campus interview. Generally, if it's an on-campus interview, you may be interviewing one-on-one with multiple faculty members, or may be interviewed as a small group with a single faculty member. You may also have interactions with graduate students, and again, always consider this part of the interview. It may involve a tour of the department, a tour of facilities, or a tour of campus, maybe even a tour of the surrounding area. A couple of things, no matter what the form takes, from the simplest phone interview to the 2-day on-site visit, you should review your resume and personal statement. You should make sure that you know everything that you've told them about yourself, and you should review any information you have about the program. While we're on the subject, briefly, if you are actually asked for an interview, you should seriously consider doing whatever it takes to go to that interview. If it is an on-campus interview, even if the school is not necessarily your first choice, if it is a choice that you may consider going to, if at all possible, go to that in-person interview. Generally speaking, and I'm not defending this, but it's the reality of the situation, when you decline an in-person interview, unless you have a really good reason because of travel or some other issue, and of course in COVID, this may change a little bit too, as a lot of programs may only be doing virtual interviews. But again, if you're asked to do an interview, a virtual interview or an in-person interview, if at all possible, go. Because if you don't, they very well may offer a phone interview or a Skype or Zoom interview instead, but you've just communicated that that program is not that important to you. That's one of the things you unfortunately just did. And it's hard for them to ignore that. So again, if it's a school that's purely a safety school and you don't think you have to go, and the only way you're going to that school is if you get in nowhere else, then you may want to consider saving the money and not going for the in-person. But the in-person interview is worth going to for any school that you're seriously considering. And finally, it's important because it also lets you determine, is that a good fit for you? Remember, this is a two-way street. It often feels like you're effectively begging to be let in, but you also hopefully are going to end up with multiple offers. And you want to know as much about each program as you can so that you can make an informed choice if you're in that enviable position of getting to choose between acceptances. So questions you may be asked, and again, we're going to go into more detail in the last slide deck that's included in this session, but you may very well be asked about your career goals. And again, I think it's good to have an answer kind of prepared that communicates how this graduate program is going to get you to your end goals. You might be asked about your interest in the grad school, so specifically the program you're applying, the university you're applying to, the psychology department you're advising to, the program, or psychology in general. You probably will be asked about strengths and weaknesses. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here is, again, you're kind of having to balance a fine line between bragging when you talk about strength and going too far when you talk about weaknesses. Remember from the previous lecture deck in session 3, we talked about some of kind of the red flags that you should avoid in your personal statements. Those should also probably be avoided when someone's asked about your weaknesses. My personal advice about weaknesses is the best weakness I think that you can talk about is something that the program will directly impact. In other words, if I was applying to a clinical program, I would say, well, clearly one of my weaknesses is that I understand the content of clinical psychology, but I've had very little practice actually working with someone who knows what they're doing and can mentor me at really applying these skills in the real world. Now you've basically turned a weakness into something that you're specifically letting them know, and that's why I'm coming to your program. You may be asked for just generally additional information about your application. They may ask you about specific research you listed in either your personal statement or your CV. You may be asked where else you applied. Now, this is a difficult question. A lot of places won't ask this, but some will. I would be honest but vague. I would probably say something like, well, I've applied to both PhD and master's programs, if that's the truth. Or if you only applied to master programs, well, I've only applied to master programs. But if you have applied to master's and PhD programs, you do want to continue with, but I'm really willing to look at both options, and that's why I applied to both. In other words, you don't want to make them think that their master's program is a safety school for you. It is okay to be honest, and again, you want to think a little bit about a lot of the questions you may ask may be behaviorally based. And what that means is they will be asking you about a specific time you did something. In other words, they're trying to gather information about how you behave in situations. And we'll talk a little bit about how to answer those behaviorally based questions in a few slides. So just some quick examples. How did you become interested in this particular field? Why did you apply to our specific program? What are your strengths? Give me some examples. What are your weaknesses? Give me some examples. Tell me about your research or field experience. And usually this is not going to be that broad. It's going to be specific. Something like on your CV, you talked about being in a cognitive research lab. Can you tell me more about the research you did in that lab? Or on your personal statement, you talked about how you worked with at-risk children at a summer camp in an inner city. Can you tell me more what you did and what that experience was like? You may be asked, and this is a common question, to tell about a time you received criticism or negative feedback and how you handled that. And one of the reasons they'll often ask that question is that typically, as you move from undergraduate to graduate school, you're going to get a lot more feedback on your work and your writing. And that feedback is going to feel fairly negative. If you are a student, you've probably gotten high grades on most of your papers and probably only little bit of feedback as far as how to make it better. That same paper might be ripped apart at a graduate level because, again, the bar has been set higher. In graduate school, you are in the process of professors trying to get you up to the level where you could write at an academic level that would allow publication. So a lot of times students do struggle with this sudden increase in criticism and negative feedback. And I don't mean vicious feedback, I mean feedback to make you a better writer. So make sure that you're ready to talk about how you would handle that in a positive way and that you're looking forward to really being pressed and stretched, if you will, by the experience. You'll almost always get some form of what questions do you have about our program or school. And again, what you want to make sure is that you have questions ready and that they're relevant questions that aren't easily answered by their website. Now, we're going to as we move to the next video, we're going to go over kind of some wrong and right answers to some of these questions. And hopefully that'll give you a better feel for this process.